How's it going, everyone? Today we're going to continue our conversation on the functions of the cardiovascular system. And what we're going to talk about today is hemorrhage or blood loss. So you may be asking, why are we discussing blood loss, such a morbid or kind of disturbing subject? Well, when you talk about cardiovascular physiology, naturally, you're going to talk about, medical aspects of it, and then, when essentially things go wrong. So we're talking about today more of a negative stressor. And the past couple of lectures, the past couple of videos, I've been discussing exercise, which is this positive stressor, right? So even though it throws us off balance and our heart output has to increase and there's changes throughout our cardiovascular system, it's example of a positive stressor, right? Today we're talking more so about hemorrhage, this blood loss, which is a negative stressor. So we get to talk more about cardiovascular function when things go wrong, right? So hemorrhage is unique that it elicits both a compensatory response and a decompensatory response. Compensatory response meaning that these are protective mechanisms and responses, which we'll talk a little bit more about in this video, part 1. And then decompensatory responses are, the mechanisms and responses for when the system is failing or begins to fail, which we'll talk a little bit more so about in part 2. With a loss of blood, what we are going to see is that cardiac output is going to start to decrease. And if you think about why, well, if we're losing blood out of somewhere in the body, that blood is not going to make its way back to the heart, and therefore our venous return goes down, our stroke volume is going to go down, and therefore our cardiac output is going to go down. Now, typically a class 1 hemorrhage, right, is blood loss up to typically 15% of blood volume. And what you're going to see up to that 15% mark is typically an increase in heart rate to compensate. But once we get above that 15% of blood volume loss, we are going to see reductions to mean arterial pressure. And the quicker the blood loss, the more rapid the decline in mean arterial pressure. What you're seeing in this figure here is basically results from experiments on animals, showing the difference between when there is loss of blood volume, how some animals have this ability to compensate, and those responses will help restore mean arterial pressure back to baseline, to what it was before the blood volume loss, while other animals may not have those same compensation mechanisms, and basically that loss of blood volume is going to lead to hemorrhagic shock. Typically, there is a point of no return, right, where that loss of blood volume, that drop in pressure, basically that decompensation, that cannot be reversed. But today we're going to talk about these compensatory mechanisms and basically how the human body responds to a loss of blood volume. Like I said, today we're going to focus more so on the compensatory mechanisms, and so these are mechanisms that help restore arterial pressure. The ones we're going to mainly focus on today are the baroreflex, the release of vasoconstrictors, and then renal conservation of salt and water. Keep in mind that also the chemo reflex, the cerebral ischemic response, and tissue reabsorption of fluids also do play a role in the compensation of arterial pressure upon blood volume loss. But again, we're just going to focus on these 3 more today. All the compensatory mechanisms represent negative feedback mechanisms, which, if you remember from your early physiology classes, is the reversal of an original stimulus. So if a stimulus like blood loss decreases mean arterial pressure, the body is working in a response in order to try to increase mean arterial pressure back to what it was. So first we'll discuss the baroreflex, and I have a figure here to help describe what happens with the baroreflex when there is a loss of blood volume. Ultimately, that loss of blood volume, like we said, is going to lead to a decrease in cardiac output, which decreases arterial pressure. And what happens is when there's that drop in arterial pressure, the baroreceptors are going to actually decrease firing, right? So you could call it activated like it is in this figure, but really what it responds to is that drop in mean arterial pressure, and pulse pressure is going to decrease the number of action potentials the baroreceptors send to this nucleus tractus solitarius. And we talked about that region of the brain in the past, and when this region of the brain is active, it elicits a depressor response, right? So by the baroreceptors decreasing their firing, that's going to inhibit this part of the brain, the NTS, and then that elicits a pressor response and increase in pressure by increasing sympathetic nervous activity and decreasing parasympathetic nervous activity. What that results in is an increase in heart rate and myocardial contractility. There's going to be an increase in vasoconstriction in order to increase TPR, and then there's going to be venoconstriction, which takes blood from the reservoirs of our body. Remember, these highly compliant regions, including the gastrointestinal tract, and ultimately what all those things do together are help raise cardiac output, help raise total peripheral resistance, and therefore we are able to restore mean arterial pressure. On this slide, what we are looking at is the results of an experiment in an animal model where we have a stimulated hemorrhage and 8% blood loss. And what we are able to see from the results of this experiment in this figure is that the carotid baroreflex plays a more important, a stronger response in the loss of blood than does the aortic baroreceptors, right? So when the carotid baroreceptors are intact, there is a significantly less drop in mean arterial pressure. There is an enhanced ability to maintain mean arterial pressure with that loss of blood volume. However, when the carotid baroreceptors are blunted and it's only the aortic baroreceptors that are active, you could see that drop in mean arterial pressure is a lot more. So again, that shows us that the carotid baroreceptors have this stronger role in regulating mean arterial pressure with a loss in blood volume than the aortic, right? So they both play a role in this response, but the carotid are more so, right? And part of that response is the vasoconstriction to these compliant regions of the body, right? And so it's vast in order to try to save mean arterial pressure, since we are losing that blood volume and therefore that cardiac output. But not all areas of the body are going to be treated the same as far as vasoconstriction is concerned. Most of it's going to occur, in the splanchnic circulation, as well as the muscle, skeletal muscle, and the skin. There is little to no vasoconstriction in the brain and the heart. Obviously, those are a little bit more important and more vital for keeping the body working during this negative stressor event. So what the brain is basically doing and what the nervous system is doing is taking away blood away from less vital regions so it can maintain the blood flow to more vital organs and more vital regions. So a big part of the cardiovascular response to a loss in blood volume is the release of vasoconstrictors. And we've talked a lot about epinephrine and norepinephrine in multiple videos, and their concentrations are going to increase by as much as 50% when there's significant loss of blood. Two more that we're going to talk a little bit more about today are vasopressin and then angiotensin II. So first, vasopressin, otherwise known as the antidiuretic hormone, which is released from the posterior pituitary gland, is a powerful vasoconstrictor and also serves to help retain fluid volume and therefore blood volume, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide. But really, again, it's going to act and help in vasoconstriction and help to increase TPR to try to prevent a huge reduction in mean arterial pressure, right? So we know that's sort of unavoidable. As we lose more blood, As there's an increase in that hemorrhage, pressure is going to start to decrease. So what the body does is that when there is that decreased stretch of the baroreceptors and the receptors in the left atrium, what ultimately happens is this increase in antidiuretic hormone, right? And what that's trying to do is, again, serve as help to promote vasoconstriction, help to promote fluid retention, and help to basically offset this drop in pressure due to that loss of fluid volume. Then we also have renin, which is part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Hopefully you remember the system from previous physiology classes. Ultimately, renin is released by the kidneys and combines with something called angiotensinogen in order to form angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 gets converted to angiotensin 2 by ACE, the angiotensin converting enzyme, and ultimately what that angiotensin 2 is going to do is help promote vasoconstriction and help promote the release of what's called aldosterone. Another compensatory mechanism of the body when there is hemorrhage is to try to conserve both sodium and water. And by increasing the sodium and fluid retention within the kidneys, that's going to help to expand plasma volume. And by increasing plasma volume, therefore, we increase blood volume, and that helps to offset that drop in cardiac output with a loss in blood volume. Again, vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone is going to act at the kidneys to promote water retention. So we're excreting less of that water out, and therefore more of that water stays within the blood volume by increasing the plasma volume. Aldosterone, as part of that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, will help to conserve sodium within the blood. And since, sodium is this polar ion and water does interact well with sodium, the retention of sodium ultimately leads to the retention of water and therefore fluid within our blood. And so by increasing the plasma volume, we help to at least try to maintain some of that blood volume, some of that cardiac output, and therefore help to try to lower these reductions in mean arterial pressure when we see a loss in blood volume. That will conclude part 1. Today we talked about the compensation the body does when there is a loss in blood volume. We talked about the baroreflex. We talked about the response to vasoconstrict and the release of vasoconstrictors and the retention of sodium and water in order to keep up with plasma volume and therefore blood volume. And so there were a few other things that we didn't really discuss about in here. We didn't really talk about the chemo reflex, which is when we have a hemorrhage, the blood becomes more acidic, there's a drop in pH, so therefore the response is to basically help with, similar to all of this here, an increase in sympathetic nervous activity, decrease in parasympathetic nervous activity. We didn't talk about the activation of the thirst response in order to try to get the individual or the animal to drink more water in order to keep up and restore some of that blood volume. But today was all about, again, the compensatory mechanisms, the things the body does in order to respond to a drop in mean arterial pressure with a loss in blood volume. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about when things start to become progressively worse with blood loss and the function of the cardiovascular system when the system is starting to fail due to that loss in blood volume. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you next lecture.